Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating piece of generational psychology. It's called the exennial dual codec personality. And what we're really looking at here is this amazing, highly productive tension between the practical, self-reliant nature of Generation X and the more idealistic, meaning-seeking energy of core millennials. So if you've ever felt like standard generational labels just don't quite capture how your brain actually works, well, you're absolutely going to want to stick around for this one. Let me ask you something. Do you possess a dual codec personality? Like, do you personally feel caught between two entirely distinct generational mindsets? Maybe you remember a childhood that was completely analog. Riding bikes around the neighborhood until the streetlights came on, memorizing your best friend's landline number. But at the exact same time, you navigate today's hyperconnected digital world just as fluently as someone who is literally born with a smartphone in their hands. If that resonates with you, you might actually belong to a very specific and highly unique microgeneration. Okay, let's dive into this. So a zennial is defined as a microgeneration. It's a term that was originally coined by Sarah Stankorb back in 2014, and it perfectly bridges that gap between Gen X and millennials. For this explainer, we're putting a real metacognitive focus specifically on this identity. We're going to look at how longitudinal studies in developmental psychology, along with sociological cohort analyses, have mapped out a completely distinct personality signature for this exact group of people. Let's quickly map out the timeline so you can see exactly where you might fit. In the US, the core birth years for exennials span from 1977 to 1985. But here's what's really crucial. The actual psychological profile for this group extends way out to about 1993 in a lot of cultural contexts. So it's really less about your strict birth year and much more about the cultural and technological environment you happen to grow up in. Which brings us to Section 1. The dual codec personality. So let's break down what that actually means. The core psychological feature of an exennial is this wild ability to seamlessly inhabit two completely different areas. On one side, you've got the analog mode. Because of how they grew up, exennials have the patience and frankly the depth of attention that comes from having a genuinely analog childhood. But then, on the flip side, there's the digital mode. They can operate at the incredibly fast pace and constant connectivity that modern digital life absolutely demands. And here's the real kicker. They can do both of these things at the exact same time without feeling any sort of cognitive dissonance. It's totally natural for them. This brings us to a super interesting concept called metacognitive flexibility. Honestly, this is the superpower of the dual codec brain, because it's not just that they can use both modes, it's that they intuitively recognize exactly when an old-school analog approach is needed versus when a fast-paced digital mode makes more sense. Pure Gen X cohorts don't have this, and pure millennial cohorts don't either, at least not in equal measure. This flexibility is completely unique to this specific bridge group. Now, what's really interesting is how this dual codec brain actually translates into real-world behavior. Let's look at Section 2, Core Trait Contrasts. So this comprehensive matrix we're looking at comes straight from the source research, really anchoring the sociological analysis here. It breaks down 8 specific trait dimensions. Things like optimism, trust, tech, work identity, social identity, conflict, authority, and nostalgia. It maps out perfectly how the exennial profile acts as this incredible counterbalance between the Gen X baseline and the millennial baseline. We're going to rapid fire through 4 of the absolute most fascinating contrasts from this data right now. First up, let's look at work identity. For Gen X, the focus is super pragmatic. It's basically an either-or equation. Pay plus freedom. Simple, right? But for the exennial, it's a balanced approach. Purpose plus stability. They want to go out and change the world with the exact same idealism as millennial, but they ground that desire in reality. Because at the end of the day, they still want the 401k and that reliable Gen X pragmatism. Contrast number 2 is all about trust in institutions. Generally speaking, millennials tend to operate on a baseline of default trust, right up until they're betrayed. Exennials, on the other hand, operate heavily on earned trust. Now, they don't necessarily have that default built-in cynicism of Gen X, but they absolutely require institutions to verify their reliability before any real loyalty is given. You got to prove it first. Highlight number 3 focuses on technology. For millennials and definitely Gen Z, tech integration happens right at the identity level. It's who they are. But for the zennial, while they are completely 100% digitally fluent, they aren't totally dependent on it. They view technology simply as a tool to get things done, not as some core defining feature of their personal identity. And our 4th rapid-fire highlight is a fun one: nostalgia. Gen X tends to look back at the past with this sort of ironic detachment. But exennials, They carry a uniquely high sensitivity and a really deep emotional weight anchored specifically to the 1990s. Think about it, the incredibly earnest connection you might feel to making mixtapes off the FM radio, or remembering the exact screeching sound of dial up internet. It's a heavy, genuine emotional connection to those analog formative years. Let's move on and see how this all builds into something even larger. Here's Section 3, the exennial worldview. This section pulls directly from longitudinal studies by Pew Research and Gallup. And our first signature belief here is the authenticity priority. Because exennials formed their core identities well before social media and personal branding took over the world, they carry this incredibly strong, deeply internalized standard for genuine self-expression. They're highly, highly sensitive to performative behavior, much more so than younger, more digitally native cohorts who grew up with it as the norm. Next up is their trust architecture. As we touched on earlier, whether they're dealing with the government, the media, megacorporations, or frankly even just new personal relationships, trust is absolutely not assumed on first contact. It has to be incrementally earned over time. They flat out demand demonstrated reliability before truly buying in. Then there is this absolutely brilliant psychological trait: complexity tolerance. You have to remember, exennials came of age during massive ideological transitions across the 1990s and the 2000s. And because of that, they developed a remarkably high tolerance for ambiguity. They literally have the ability to hold competing, totally unresolved ideas in their heads simultaneously without feeling the need to force some premature black and white resolution. It's pretty amazing. And a huge reason for that specific worldview comes straight from the massive systemic disruptions this cohort had to navigate during their most crucial developmental and early professional years. I mean, think about it. They endured 9/11, then the 2008 global financial crisis, and then COVID-19, all sequentially. Navigating those incredibly heavy, world-altering events established a deep, just unshakable baseline of resilience. And this brilliantly illustrates our ultimate takeaway today, which is captured perfectly in this quote from the research. Disruption is expected and metabolized rather than experienced as categorical crisis. Think about how powerful that is. Because they have that dual codec brain, and because they've navigated so much systemic shock already, resilience is quite literally just their default setting. When things go wrong, they don't panic, they process. Which leaves us with a pretty thought-provoking question to end on. With their unmatched complexity tolerance and their ability to effortlessly shift between analog depth and digital speed, how will this dual codec generation lead us through the inevitable disruptions of the future? When you really look at the data, they are practically custom-built for an unpredictable world. So think about that the next time you find yourself naturally bridging the gap between old-school pragmatism and new-school idealism. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you some fresh clarity on a truly fascinating microgeneration.